All right. So first of all, I like everybody else. I'm really happy that this is, I've been involved with the Hebrews project from a pretty early stage, actually, working through things, and I'm very pleased to see and very excited for what it's bringing to the table in terms of Latter-day Saint engagement with the New Testament. So, as we talk about this here, the Epistle to the Hebrews it's an intriguing and somewhat difficult book of Scripture in terms of ascertaining, and we talked a little bit already, in terms of ascertaining authorship and audience, and how that plays out and what that means within the text. From a very early period, and we'll talk more about this, Hebrews has been viewed as kind of an example of sort of a Jewish Christianity, and we already had some thoughts with that. And largely, this comes about because the epistle lacks any specific stated geographic or personal audience, as we see in some other parts and epistles in the New Testament. But it has, and we'll talk more about this, a lot of allusions and quotations from various passages in the Hebrew Bible, from the Hebrew Bible Old Testament. These allusions are sort of part of the reason why it's sort of traditionally called to the Hebrews. And within that, and we'll talk a little bit more about this also, not only does Hebrews make much of its argument from the Hebrew Bible Old Testament, it does so in such a way that appears almost rabbinic. And we'll put that in scare quotes, because the rabbinicness of it is intriguing. But Hebrews is often laid out as one of the chief exemplars for a kind of Jewish Christianity. We've already had a great discussion from Tom Roberts here on the importance of understanding Judaism to understand the New Testament. And again, as a Christian who studies Rabbinic Judaism professionally, I will second much of what has been said. For my paper, I will be building on some of these ideas and suggesting, in fact, that Jewish Christianity, as understood as a subset of New Testament Christianity in general, or Christianity in general even, may not be the most useful way for thinking about the Epistle to the Hebrews, or even about Christianity in general. Daniel Boyarin, who has long been a major figure in the discussion of the often fraught relationship between Judaism and Christianity, has recently written questioning whether the category of Jewish Christianity is even a proper ancient category. This paper continues in the vein of Boyarin's argument and suggests that rather than being an exemplar of a kind of Jewish Christianity, or of Judaizers in the church, or even an example of Christianity rejecting Judaism, the Epistle to the Hebrews represents part of a complex tapestry of Greek and Judaism and Hebrew that made up all of early Christianity, especially as expressed in the New Testament. Indeed, my suggestion is that it might not be preferable to suggest a sharp divide between the Testaments and the communities in antiquity. The epistle is an important part of this complex tapestry. In this paper, I will first examine a few examples illustrating the essential Jewishness of the New Testament. Then I will illustrate this with specific examples from Hebrews. And finally, and this is sort of the last part of my title there, I will show how Joseph Smith and the Restoration builds off of this and is in continuity with this lack of division between, again, in many ways, between the two Testaments. Now, the New Testament in general, and Hebrews in particular, represent what we'll call a kind of hybrid literature. All of the New Testament is written by Jews. Indeed, all of the earliest followers of Jesus were Jewish, like Jesus himself was. In fact, and we already alluded to this a little bit already, Jesus is one of only two people called rabbi in a first century document. The other is John the Baptist. And it's both New Testament. In both cases, it's New Testament. The only example from the first century we have of the word rabbi is the New Testament. Even the notion of Messiah itself is a fundamentally Jewish one, coming as it does out of notions of Judaic kingship. Thus, the Gospels present and work through and think about Jesus in ways that derive from his Jewish background. An example of this in the Gospels. Matthew and Mark in particular show Jesus in legal controversies about the law of Moses. They do so in part to show Jesus as master of the law, and show him as being able to do the proper interpretations. And actually, this is not some kind of aside in their argument. Jesus' ability to properly interpret the law of Moses is integral part of his claims to kingship and messiahship. Deuteronomy 17, verses 18 to 19, this is the famous law of the king, contains the laws and rules by which Israelite kings are to govern. And it shall be, when the king sitteth upon the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write himself, a copy of this law in a book, out of that which is before the priests, the Levites, and it shall be with him, and he shall read therein all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, to keep all the words of this law and these statutes to do them. As Deuteronomy presents kingship, knowledge and possession of the law are integral parts of what it means to be a proper king, and in fact, study of the law is part of kingly behavior. Jesus' ability to respond to legal questions about the law of Moses is not simply just a broad Jewish environment, it is a central aspect of his messianic and kingly mission. Sorry, my page is here. Likewise, by presenting Jesus as master here, the Gospels underscore Jesus' position as divine giver of the law. And this is, of course, most visible in Matthew's presentation of the Sermon on the Mount, but it undergirds all the Gospel trails of Jesus. Just as King Jesus must be conversant with the law, so as the divine Son of God, he's the ultimate authority on matters of the law, since he is the one who originally gave it. And of course, this is made explicit in the Book of Mormon and 3rd Nephi. The Gospel's presentation of Jesus is fundamentally a Jewish one, because being Messiah, being Christ, is fundamentally a Jewish claim. You go to a Roman and ask them about Judaic kingship, and they will not care. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we talk about Paul here in a second. Part of the intriguiness of the success of Christianity is this ability to make them care about Judaic kingship, to make people say this is something that matters outside of a Jewish concept. That's part of the beauty of this whole thing. The Jewishness of Christianity's essential claims is also at play in other parts of the New Testament, including those that have an audience that is explicitly non-Jewish. Paul's epistle to the Romans is actually a great example of this. Paul is, of course, like Jesus and the earliest Jesus followers, Jewish, although his specific commitments to the practice of the law and Jewish tradition is a matter of, we'll say, discussion among commentators. It's a place where we fight about how much does Paul actually live in these things. Paul self-identifies as Israelite in several places in his letters, including in Romans 11:1. Romans is, of course, the letter where Paul is working through notions of salvation centered on the grace of Jesus Christ, without the, quote his term, works of the law. For some thinkers, therefore, Romans is this kind of essential center of a Christian thinking. Yet, even in Romans, Paul builds his argument on numerous passages drawn from the Hebrew Scriptures. A similar phenomenon is seen in the Epistle to the Galatians, where Paul is once again expressing the inability of the law to provide salvation. His entire argument in Galatians, however, is built around the idea that Abraham received blessings to the law. Blessings before the law. Okay, so Abraham received blessings, Abraham was blessed, therefore Abraham received blessings without the law. This is kind of the whole thrust of it. It is an argument that comes out of the Hebrew Bible. It is therefore still an essentially Jewish argument. It is not an argument based on rhetoric. It is an argument coming from a Jewish background here. And this is part of what's intriguing as you read the New Testament. Non-Jewish Christians seem to have accepted the validity of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, as a place for making arguments about Jesus as the Messiah Christ and as a source for truth. The Epistle to the Hebrews is in continuity with these considerations. Much like the rest of the New Testament, Hebrews is firmly grounded in an idea of the applicability of the Hebrew Scriptures. even largely understood through a Greek environment. And again, sometimes we worry too much about the languages. Of course, Dr. Gray has alluded to Josephus. Josephus writes exclusively in Greek. There is no sense that Josephus is not a Jew making Jewish arguments. And so this idea that Greek changes things is a little bit outside of the pale here. Now, what's intriguing with as you read Hebrews, it seems obvious within the epistles that the law of Moses, and especially the temple cult, still have, in their view, some kind of explanatory power. And maybe even some kind of notions of salvific ideas in there. The very fact that the primary argument in Hebrews 8 and 9 is that Jesus' sacrifice was a superior sacrifice that offered in the Jewish system, the law of Moses system, suggests that the temple sacrificial system is still a moving concern for the audience in Hebrews. And again, as Dr. has pointed out to us, what that concern looks like will differ from community to community, but this is still in a fundamentally Jewish argument. In many ways, actually, and this is again a brief aside there, in many ways, the situation in the book of Hebrews parallels something similar in the book of Mormon, which places salvation through Jesus Christ of primary interest, in spite of continued importance to the law of attached to the law of Moses. Hebrews is read to an audience which still contains respect and care for the Old Covenant and the Old Law. As in other places in the New Testament, Christ's sacrifice, according to the author of Hebrews, fulfills the law rather than annuls or replaces it. And of course, this is part of the suggestion of the audience that has a Jewish background. Since the law remains important with their thoughts, and again, this would not be, the argument goes this would not be a place for Greek converts, although again, Paul's letters really nuances this discussion, because we see Paul attempting to convince primarily Greek converts with arguments drawn primarily from the Hebrew Scriptures. And so there's a lot of going here. All of this difficulty lessens under the suggestion that we are not looking for a clean break with the Judaism on one hand and Christian on the other hand. What we're seeing here then is that there's a continuity between these. Now, as we think about what this means and sort of the audience and how that plays out in notions of audience in Hebrew, there are lots of suggestions about this, house churches in Rome, and of course, again, it's really best to take kind of a middle road there and say, here's kind of our suggestions for it. But one of the intriguing pieces of evidence, and this plays into where we're moving here, is the lack of any discussion of church organization in the epistle. Not only is there no specific ecclesiology, such as in the epistle of the Ephesians, there is no reference to any of the traditional offices of the New Testament church. There are no apostles, bishops, deacons, elders, or any of that. There's only a vague reference to hierarchy and to leaders. KJV has them that rule over you in Hebrews 13:17. However, as you think about even though there's no specific lack of ecclesiology, so hierarchy is not a significant part of the argument in Hebrews, however, there is discussion, this is kind of our title here for the whole day, with Jesus Christ as the great high priest. And we'll actually see that Joseph Smith in the Restoration will take notions of Jesus Christ as the great high priest and give it ecclesiological ideas. And we'll work through that in a second. Thinking about the audience in Hebrews, and again, the author of these kinds of things, is useful because it illustrates in many ways how little we know for certain about the world of early Christianity. We have these texts, and we kind of draw from them, but in terms of specific ideas, there's not a lot there. Even more, as we think about this, the audience of Hebrews is clearly expected by the author to have significant knowledge of the Hebrew scriptures and of Old Testament traditions, as well as a deep respect for continued explanatory and, again, maybe even salvific power for the sacrificial system. When this is added to the high level of Greek in the epistle, including some very, very definite rhetorical terms, a broad picture of the audience comes clear. These are Christians who have been long associated with as long as you can be at this period, with Christianity and Judaism, because again, the author in a number of places says, you guys ought to know better. I shouldn't have to be explaining this to you again. They are well educated in Greek and Hellenistic thinking and in Jewish thinking. In many ways, the audience of the epistle is as transitional as the epistle itself is. It is situated at the crossroads between a putative old and a putative new covenant. An audience clearly appreciating the old law and apparently being open to instruction that suggests that the new law is in continuity with but replaces that old law. This then brings us back to the question of Jewish Christianity in the New Testament period. All of the evidence, and there's a lot more that we could talk about here, which we haven't for what of time, suggests that for the New Testament in general, and Hebrews in specific, resists easy categorization of Jewish or non-Jewish. Instead, what we have here is a sense of continuity, even while acknowledging key differences, such as, particularly, the role of Jesus in all of this. And so as we work through and look and think about the New Testament, it is worth noting that it is a Jewish document, even as it is a Christian document. And part of what we're suggesting here is kind of a little bit of blurring of these strong confines between the Old and the New Testament as they're inherited to us in Christian discourse. Now, we're going to move a little bit to the Restoration here. The lack of clear-cut categories had a powerful influence on the thought of Joseph Smith. And we see him in the Restoration drawing freely on categories of what might be termed both Old Testament and what might be termed New Testament. This is visible in Joseph's revelatory contributions to the ecclesiology of the restored Church of Jesus Christ. In the 6th article of faith, Joseph states, "We believe in the same organization that existed in the primitive church, namely apostles, prophets, pastors, teachers, evangelists, and so forth." Joseph here is drawing on language from Ephesians 4:11, which I have on the other side there, suggesting that the restored Church of Jesus Christ is organized around New Testament ecclesiological grounds. There are, of course, certain reflections of New Testament ecclesiology in the Church of the Restoration, Of course, a big example of this are apostles, one of the hallmarks of the New Testament church, and of course, Joseph and Oliver Cowdery are described as apostles as early as 1830. Indeed, the apostolic office is inherent to the self-understanding of the restored church. In a similar vein, pastors and evangelists, as noted here in Article of Faith 6, have a specific kind of echo of New Testament that would have been very familiar and we see in 19th century American Christianity. However, in continuity with Hebrews, and in many ways what we find in the New Testament, Joseph Smith is not content with this kind of specific first century Christian echo. For Joseph, there is clear continuity between the world and religious practices of, again, we term the Old Testament, within the confines of the New Testament. The argument of the 6th article of faith speaks of evangelists in the Church of Jesus Christ. The core meaning of the word evangelist is, of course, one who spreads the good news of the gospel, and often refers to members of Christian denominations who go out and spread Christianity. Certainly, with its robust proselytizing program, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has a place for calling its missionaries evangelists. Yet that is not how Joseph Smith understood the word. Joseph's scribe, Willard Richards, records a sermon in 1839 where Joseph Smith stated, "An evangelist is a patriarch, even the oldest man of the blood of Joseph or of the seed of Abraham. Wherever the Church of Christ is established in the earth, there should be a patriarch for the benefit of the posterity of the saints, as it was with Jacob, in giving patriarchal blessings unto his sons, etc." Here, Joseph Smith equates the New Testament position of evangelist with the church office of patriarch, an office that is firmly situated in the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible. This is made apparent by Joseph's expansion in this quotation. Joseph references the blood of Joseph, meaning the son of Jacob, and the seed of Abraham, connecting this office to the ideas, especially to the ideas in Genesis and other places, of the Abrahamic covenant. He then explicitly connects the patriarch evangelist and the practice of patriarchal blessings with the giving of Jacob of blessings to his sons, the eponymous answer to the 12 tribes as currently recorded in Genesis 49. The evangelist, with its kind of New Testament associations of missionary work, and this is how it has taken throughout most of Christianity, is instead understood in connection with the Old Testament experience of passing on blessings to and through one's posterity. The Old and New Testament come together to create a complex tapestry. In a similar vein, and even more closely tied to the Epistle of Hebrews, is Joseph's understanding of priesthood, as revealed through his revelations and his teachings. As mentioned previously, the Epistle to the Hebrews does not contain any specific ecclesiology. It does reference, however, the Old Testament law codes and narrative, which speak of a high priest, the chief priest responsible for running the temple and for maintaining the sacrificial cult. Hebrews uses this high priest to show the superiority of Jesus and his redemptive work, as Dr. Gray has so nicely shown for us. Hebrews states, do I have that one up here? I do. For every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices. Wherefore it of necessity that this man have somewhat also to offer. And of course, this man in this verse refers to Jesus Christ. Much of the biblical record on priesthood is based on the claim that only those from the Israelite tribe of Levi could function as priests. This point of view is well expressed in a narrative in 1 Kings 12. After Jeroboam I rebels against Rehoboam and becomes king over the northern kingdom of Israel, he sets up in Dan and Bethel 2 national shrines to rival the temple in Jerusalem. To the horror of 1 Kings 12:31, Jeroboam, quote, made priests from the whole people, including those who were not from the children of Levi, close quote. This presents a difficulty to the claim of Christ's priesthood made in Hebrews about Jesus Christ, since, quote, it is evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah, of which tribe Moses said nothing about priesthood. Hebrews claims that Jesus is a priest, but according to this, Jesus cannot be a Levitical priest because Jesus is not a Levite. The epistle solves the problem by an appeal to Psalm 110, verse 4. The Lord has sworn and will not repent. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Hebrews is then asked, somewhat rhetorically, if perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it people received the law, what further need was there for another priest? Should rise after the order of Melchizedek and not be called after the order of Aaron. So if Levitical law is sufficient, why even talk about Melchizedek? Now, of course, Melchizedek is a somewhat obscure figure from Genesis 14 who is both king and priest, and to whom Abraham gives tithes. Because his presentation of the Bible in Genesis is so enigmatic, Melchizedek was a potent figure in Second Temple Judaism, a potency that was transferred in Hebrews, we see transferred in Hebrews, to early Christianity. Melchizedek provides the author of Hebrews with an answer to the question of Jesus Christ's priesthood, being a non-Levitical figure who was both king and priest. Even as Hebrews builds its case as why a Levitical priest was not sufficient, it does so with arguments built out of the Hebrew Scriptures. The argument is, Jesus is a non-Levitical priest because we already know there are priests forever after the order of Melchizedek. Therefore, although the Hebrews does not contain any of the traditional offices of the New Testament church, it is a mistake to suggest that the epistle has no ecclesiological concerns. Its concern with priesthood places it firmly in an ecclesiological discussion, but one that is rooted in the Hebrew Scriptures, dealing with notions arising in relation between law, kingship, and priesthood. Hebrews suggests that the organizational priesthood under the law of Moses was not sufficient for salvation and offers, rather famously, a more excellent way. Joseph Smith's revelations about the church build on the structure provided by both Ephesians and Hebrews, freely mixing what are considered Old Testament notions with those coming from a New Testament perspective. This suggests the restoration itself pushes against the idea of a Jewish Christianity that needs to somehow be contrasted with a Gentile Christianity. The position that Joseph Smith carves out is that the restoration draws on all aspects of the scriptural record, not just on those from the New Testament. Joseph articulates this in a letter written. It's written by the elders of the church in Kirtland, but Joseph Smith is included in this group. It's often cited by him. Specifically, Joseph says, "We may conclude that though there were..." Do I have... Oh, there's that one. This one. "We may conclude that though there were different dispensations, yet all things which God commanded to his people were calculated to draw his minds to that great object, and teach them to rely alone as the author of him alone as the author of their salvation, as contained in his law." Thus, for Joseph Smith, and by the way, this is one of the distinctive teachings of the Restoration. For Joseph Smith, the New Testament and the gospel is available from the very beginning. This is from that same letter. If we notice that according to Paul, the gospel was preached to Abraham, we would like to be informed in what name the gospel was then preached, whether it was in the name of Christ or some other name. If in any other name was it the gospel? And the answer to this rhetorical question is going to be no. If it's not through Jesus, it's not the gospel. And so not only does he suggest a continuity between the Old Testament into the New Testament, Joseph goes the other way and says continuity between the Old Testament the New Testament into the Old Testament. This is finally played out in his notion on notions of priesthood and the restoration thereof, which builds strongly on ideas coming from the Epistle to the Hebrews. In Doctrine and Covenants 76, Joseph describes those who receive celestial glory. They are they who are the church of the firstborn. They are they into whose hands the Father has given all things. They are they who are priests and kings, who have received of his fullness and of his glory, and are priests of the Most High God, after the order of Melchizedek, which after the order of Enoch, which after the order of the only begotten Son. Wherefore it is written, they are gods, even the sons of God. We saw previously how Hebrews, and by the way, even the idea of the church of the firstborn comes right out of Hebrews. We saw previously how Hebrews drew on the figure of Melchizedek in order to explain how a non-Levitical Jesus could be priest. Joseph further draws on that to suggest how all of us can be priests like Jesus after the order of Melchizedek. Spencer Fluman suggests that, talking about these things, those who overcome by faith, who are washed and cleansed from all their sins, and who are sealed with the Holy Spirit of promise, will become exalted and become like their divine parents. They will be priestesses and queens, priests and kings, and will dwell in the presence of God and his Christ forever. Jesus after the Melchizedek, because he cannot be a Levitical priest, but Joseph takes that to show the true order here is always that Melchizedek was a priest like Jesus. Once again, the boundaries between the Old and New Testament are challenged and ultimately rejected. And that division is then brought into the church for all of us. In conclusion, a close examination of the New Testament shows that rather than being an automatic, obvious break between Christianity and Judaism, instead Christianity retained continuity with its Jewish roots. Reading Hebrews suggests a complete dichotomy between the Old and New Testament is a false one. Rather than representing a specific strand of Jewish Christianity, Hebrews reflects the inherent continuity between Judaism and Christianity. Joseph Smith's teachings and revelations continued in this trend. One of the distinctive characteristics of the Restoration is the way it draws on and often combines ideas that come from both the Old and New Testament. The division into Aaronic and Melchizedek orders, the existence of patriarchs and high priests alongside bishops and deacons, even the notion that priesthood represents something that comes from Melchizedek in similitude of Jesus. All of these things point to the idea that the Restoration continues to break down these barriers and returning to the trend visible already in the New Testament itself. Thank you very much.